Hello and welcome everyone to the latest research seminar from the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre. My name is Hassan Bakshi and I'm Director of the Creative PEC, and it's really great to see people joining from all the different time zones. So it really is a global gathering today, so really looking forward to this. The high interest that we've had in today's seminar is testament to the quality of the speakers, of course, and the policy relevance of the topic. So I'm delighted to introduce three stellar speakers. We have Stuart Cunningham, who is the Distinguished Emeritus Professor at the QUT, the Queen's University of Technology, and a Professor at the University of Canberra. Stuart is a leading researcher and advocate for the development of creative industries policy. He directed the first ARC Centre of Excellence based outside the hard sciences, which was Creative Industries and Innovation, from 2005 to 2014, and which incidentally was an inspiration for the Creative PEC. Stuart has advised successive Australian governments and agencies in communications and arts portfolios, and internationally has worked closely with organisations such as Nesta, my alma mater, and is also a Creative PEC Research Fellow. Marion McCutcheon is a communication economist and senior research fellow at the University of Canberra's News and Media Research Centre, with extensive experience as a policy researcher and academic. Her interests include the media industries and the creative economy and how society benefits from investing in culture. Her recent work includes books co-authored with Sue Turnbull from the University of Wollongong, Transnational TV Crime from Scandinavia to Outback, and with QUT's Anna Potter, Australian Cultural Policy Unravelled, the Digital Demise of National Television Drama. And last but not least, Scott Brooke, who is Associate Professor of Communication at the School of Media and Communication at RMIT in Melbourne. Scott is a cultural policy and CCI researcher with a focus on creative labour, cultural vocations and labour market outcomes for creative graduates. He is co-editor with Roberta Communion, another Creative PEC Research Fellow, and colleagues of the volume Gender and the Creative Labour Market, graduates from Australia and the UK. So today's topic, many of you will be familiar with the groundbreaking Stuart and his colleagues did at QUT 2 decades ago on measuring the creative economy. In a new ARC research grant, they've been taking this research forward in important new directions, one of which we're going to hear about today, namely creative qualifications. So before I hand over to the speakers, let me just tell you a little bit about the format. The speakers are going to be given about 30 minutes or so to present their work, their research, which will leave us about 20 minutes for Q&A. And just to make sure that we can pack in as many questions as we can in the time available, I'm going to ask you to post your questions as they come to mind in the Q&A format, in the Q&A tool on Teams. So with no further ado, let me hand over to the presenters.
Thank you very much, Hassan. Very briefly, this is the context for our presentation this evening. We're currently conducting an Australian Research Council linkage grant. Linkage grants are government research grants which facilitate connections with industry. Industry defined very broadly. This is research that is original research. It's not commissioned or consultancy style research. It's work that guarantees that academic independence is maintained and that our academic output is always a sine qua non of the research. So it's a very interesting scheme that we have been real beneficiaries of. So Marion and I work for the University of Canberra, and Scott works at the RMIT University in Melbourne. And we're in partnership with Creative Australia, which used to be called Australian Council for the Arts, now called Creative Australia, national arts support body. And then two state agencies, Create South Australia and the Western Australian Department of Creative Industries, Tourism and Sport, and the major municipality in Australia, the City of Sydney. We've got 5 components in this research, and we're looking at the major, or we're presenting the major outcome from the first. That is the development of the so-called third version of the Creative Trident. So let me provide some introductory contextual remarks. The idea of creative industries is that there are vital connections between the arts, design and architecture, screen and radio, advertising and marketing, publishing and media, and creative software and digital content, and that these connections form a plausible, indeed dynamic industry continuum. Over 25 years since its coinage in the late 1980s, much energy has been spent advocating for one side of the dichotomy between intrinsic and instrumental value, between cultural and commercial worth. Often conducted, particularly in the humanities and creative arts disciplines, at the level of high principle with a thin gestural layer of empirics. Such thinking has often produced more heat than light. This kind of debate has often as well inhibited public policy development and challenged politicians who have sought to buy in, or at least that is what it looks like from where we sit in the world. The biggest problem has been fitting the square peg of high growth creative applications of ICT into the round hole of traditional arts and cultural production. This is the central question that I think is the question of the coherence of the concept. I'm going to just give two signal examples of this. So if we can have the third slide, thanks, Marion. The note of concern was struck early by Nicholas Garnham in 2005 when he said that the creative industries draws its political and ideological power from the prestige and economic performance, economic importance attached to concepts of innovation, information workers, and the impact of ICT, drawn from information society theory. This sustains the unjustifiable claim of the cultural sector as a key economic growth sector within the global economy. And if we can have the next slide, please. An attack on the coherence of the sector came from a different angle in the later years. The study by Peter Campbell, Dave O'Brien, and Mark Taylor of patterns of cultural consumption amongst cultural and creative industries workers. This study follows Garnham's critique insofar as the inclusion of ICT industry sectors is regarded as an expedient way to boost the economic data published by DCMS. They then question ICT workers' inclusion on sociological grounds through showing that ICT workers have lower rates of cultural consumption relative to other creative and cultural workers. And they say some CCI workers have distinctly high cultural consumption, others reflect their broader social class, and some, including IT workers, show lower than expected consumption. Overall, we question the coherence of the prevailing CCI category, particularly in government policy. In this seminar, we take a different approach. Our study of qualifications correlated with occupations takes neither a high-level political economic nor a consumption perspective. We offer fresh evidence for the coherence of the broad creative sector expressed through shared qualifications. On our evidence, creatives across all subsectors fundamentally share creative and humanities qualifications. Marion is now going to step through the development of the methodology that we call the third version, Creative Trident III, and then present the main findings of the research. And then Scott will consider the implications of our method and findings for research and debate on creative and liberal arts education. So over to you, Marion.
Thanks, Stuart. Look, before I get started, I'm just going to run through some of the concepts that we're using. First, the Creative Trident, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. It's a simple model that cross-tabulates employment data for creative industries and creative occupations to identify three different categories of workers. Specialists who work in creative occupations within the creative industries, and they're coloured orange in the table on the left in front of you. Support professionals who work in support roles in the creative industries, coloured blue, and embedded creatives who work in creative occupations in other industries, coloured green. We are proposing a new iteration of the Creative Trident, integrating qualifications as a third dimension. And this allows us to see how creative qualifications are creative occupations, coloured orange in the table on the right, creative qualifications employed in other occupations, coloured green, and other qualifications that are employed in creative occupations, coloured blue. Another little refresher, creative occupations and industries are highly diverse, and the Trident approach recognises this by defining 7 sectors and splitting them into 2 groups. So the mostly business-to-business creative services sectors are advertising and marketing, architecture and design, and software and digital content. And the mostly business-to-consumer cultural production sectors are film, TV and radio, music and performing arts, publishing and visual arts. And the last concept slide is about Australian employment statistics. We use the Australian census as our main data source. It's conducted every 5 years and it's coded at the most detailed level of our occupation and industry classification systems. Its only downside is that it only records those jobs that are a main source of income. So it tends to undercount areas of work where there are high rates of multiple job holding, such as the arts. The classification systems we're using today are the Australian and New Zealand Standard Classification of Occupations, called the ANSCO for short, and the Australian Standard Classification of Education, the ASCED. Now, the ANSCO was reviewed only recently, and we have a new classification system called the OSCAR. It hasn't actually been implemented yet, but there are new categories in that for design, digital design and IT, which we are looking forward to using in the future. But for now, we are stuck with the older ANSCO, which does have limitations. And we'll get into that later as well. The ASCED, on the other hand, it sets up 2 classification schemes, one for fields of education and one for levels of education. Here we're using the ASCED's fields of education to identify creative qualifications. Now, we're not the first researchers in Australia to consider creative qualifications. Our work came about as a response to a 2019 report called Creative Skills for the Future Economy, published by the Australian Government's Bureau of Communications and Arts Research, BCAR. BCAR was interested in showing the extent to which creative qualifications are employed across the workforce. And using census employment data, this time from 2016, they claimed that 9.5% of the Australian workforce held a creative qualification as its highest qualification. They also concluded that creative qualifications are strongly correlated to industries that are high growth, innovative, automation resistant and have export potential, and that the most prevalent of creative qualifications are communication and media studies and graphic and design studies. Now, we were extremely excited by BCAR's finding that 9.5% of the workforce held a creative qualification. It meant that creative skills were pervasive across the economy and well exceeded our Creative Trident estimates of all creative employment at 5.5%. Except, as we looked more closely at BCAR's method, we began to find it had some problems. So determining exactly what is a creative qualification is not straightforward. For creative occupations, we have an established method for doing this, the dynamic mapping method that was developed by Hassan Bakshi, Peter Higgs, Stuart Cunningham. But BCAR decided to take a different approach for qualifications. They set a prevalence threshold, defining creative qualifications as those fields of education that were 1.5 times more likely to be employed in creative occupations than in other occupations. Now, while this sounds like a reasonable starting point, our testing of this approach revealed 3 problems. The first was that BCAR did not use the most detailed data available for identifying creative qualifications. So this meant that they were working with groups of qualifications or fields of education that included those that were both associated with teaching creative skills and not. Consequently, they overestimated the extent to which creative qualifications are held by the workforce. The second problem was the subjectivity of the threshold. While BCAR defined creative qualifications as those that were 1.5 times more likely to be employed in creative occupations than other qualifications, in practice, there was no clear cutoff point, and instead they blend into each other. So we also experimented with a threshold of 2, and this chart shows the 48 qualifications that are twice as likely to be employed in a creative occupation and that therefore might be defined as creative. You can see here that these qualifications, fields of education, are predominantly in the creative arts, coloured red, followed by architecture and building, coloured dark blue. But the many non-creative fields of education here demonstrate how the threshold method is not reliable for identifying creative qualifications. The ones captured here include earth sciences in brown, engineering in light blue, and a cluster of catch-all categories for IT, which are in yellow. And there's a third problem here, scalability. Applying the threshold method to single occupations or to groups of occupations yields very different results. If we apply a threshold of 2 to all creative occupations, we get the list of 48 fields of education you can see here. If we apply it to each and every creative occupation separately, we end up with a list of 270 potential creative qualifications, which is 2/3 of the full list of 402 fields of education in the ASCED. These three problems meant we needed a different method, one that was stable across all creative occupations and robust over time, just as dynamic mapping has provided a robust method for identifying creative occupations. Our first attempt was, using an approach similar to dynamic mapping. But we found that the criteria developed for identifying creative occupations, and they include creativity, skills, output, and process, they couldn't be consistently applied to fields of education. It was often impossible to translate the roles and outcomes encompassed by a creative occupation in terms of the skills taught in a qualification. So instead, we found that the most plausible connection between qualifications and occupations lay in the activity definitions contained within the ANSCO and the ASCED. Because both systems include descriptions of the activities that are central to each occupation and each field of study, we could identify the qualifications that were most likely to teach the skills that are required in each creative occupation. Now, the table that you can see here lists all the detailed fields of education we have identified as creative qualifications based on this approach. It includes 67 detailed fields of education, more than the 48 identified by applying BCAR's relative prevalence method to all creative occupations, and significantly less than the 270 identified by applying it to individual creative occupations. Now, a quick note, we did make one critical manual adjustment here. For the narrow fields of information technology and sales and marketing, we've deliberately excluded the not elsewhere classified and the not further defined fields. These are catch-all fields where it's not necessarily clear where they need to be classified. Now, these two narrow fields, IT and sales and marketing, they include a mix of detailed fields of education that teach both creative and non-creative skills. And we chose to exclude their associated NEC and NFD fields, as it was impossible to determine whether they were teaching creative skills or not. So, what happened when we applied this list to the 2021 census? We found that in 2021, 6.5% of the Australian workforce held a creative qualification as their highest qualification. This is a more conservative and a more defensible headline figure than the 9.5% proposed by BCAR for 2016. This table also shows that workers in creative occupations are more likely to hold a qualification of any kind than those in other occupations, 87.6% compared with 68.8%. And it shows that non-creative fields of education are very important in creative occupations. Qualifications held by people in creative occupations are almost perfectly evenly split between creative qualifications and other qualifications. We also applied our method to longitudinal data. The blue sections at the bottom of each bar here show people holding a creative qualification as their highest qual. And this has increased by nearly 50% over this time period, from 4.5% of all employed people in 2006 to 6.5% in 2021. This is strong growth, but our estimates are still significantly lower than those published by BCAR. And we're especially interested in testing employment data to see if there's any evidence for the coherence of the creative industries concept. These charts show employment by qualification type in each of the 7 creative occupation sector definitions. And remember that the creative services sectors are those that generally offer business-to-business services, while the cultural production sectors are more traditional arts, straight-to-consumer services. First of all, looking at the figure on the left, which shows employment counts, we can see what we already know. There are many more jobs in creative services than in cultural production. And if we look at the number of workers with creative qualifications, again shown by the blue bars, you can see that the creative services sectors of advertising and marketing and architecture and design follow the same pattern and employ more people with creative qualifications than all other sectors. Software and digital content, on the other hand, employs very similar numbers of people with creative qualifications to the cultural production sectors, despite being the second largest employer overall. But if we look at the proportion of workers in each sector, this is the chart on the right, we see something different. There's greater consistency across the creative services and cultural production sectors, with around 1/2 of all workers holding creative qualifications. There are, however, 2 exceptions. Architecture and design has the highest proportion of workers with creative qualifications at 76%. This most likely reflects the professional education requirements in this sector. And software and digital design has the lowest proportion of creative qualifications at 15%. This very low proportion is due to 2 things: the highly diverse range of fields of study that prepare people for work in this sector, and our decision to exclude fields of education that grouped together creative and non-creative skills. And one of the first things we did was to see if there was any different patterning in the qualifications employed in each creative sector. And to start with, we calculated correlation coefficients. You can see here that correlations are mostly positive, and many are reasonably strong. But by reading down the columns or across the rows, you can see these sectors, or you can see the sectors that have very similar qualification profiles. For example, people working in advertising and marketing occupations have similar qualifications to those in film, TV, and radio, and in publishing. Those in architecture and design have similar qualifications to those in software and digital content and in visual arts. People in film, TV, and radio have similar qualifications to those in music and performing arts, publishing, and visual arts, as well as advertising and marketing. But this kind of presentation is a bit awkward, and we're dealing here with census data, not a sample that requires statistical methods. So our next step was visual analysis. So this shows creative qualifications as fields of education ranked by creative occupation sector. And I've shaded the rankings from the strong blue for the most popular qualifications to the pale yellow for the least popular. This unambiguously demonstrates that there are significant similarities in the qualifications commonly held by people working across all creative occupation sectors. Excuse me. A small number of outliers, these are qualifications that might only be relevant in one sector, but it's clear that there are similarities. Sorry, it's clear here that the similarities are stronger than the differences. Topping the list as the most popular qualifications across all sectors are graphic arts and design studies, communication and media studies, not further defined, creative arts, not further defined, audiovisual studies, and marketing. Journalism comes in at number 6. Overall, the top 12 qualifications in this list are creative arts and humanities qualifications, with the sole exception of marketing. These creative arts and humanities qualifications rank highly in all 7 creative sectors, including software and digital content occupations, where graphic arts and design and media and communications, not elsewhere classified, are the second and third highest ranked detailed fields of education after programming. So a quick wrap up before I hand over to Scott. Adding a third dimension to the Creative Trident for qualifications demonstrates that the creative workforce shares common skill sets across occupation specialisations. Despite differences in workforce size and growth rates, there is demand for general humanities and creative arts skills across the creative industries, and there are career opportunities and pathways here. That creative production and creative services share common skills and training reinforces the coherence of the creative industries concept. And Scott will pick up on this. Sorry, I've got a dog barking in the background. We're not only relying on economic statistics to test this, we're also collecting our own data on embedded creative employment. We've just launched a survey of creatives working in Western Australia's largest industry, mining and resources. And we're connecting our research to work being conducted by the federal government agencies, Creative Australia and SACSA. Their work is revealing that industry is indeed hungry for creative skills. And Scott, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Marion. Look, I'm just going to round out the talk with 3 sets of macro level, what we call macro level considerations that came out of this course of research, and which we think are worth pointing out for research going forward. And the first of these is in some ways an obvious point, but I think we feel it's often forgotten, which is that the creative industries are defined by skills and not just cultural or creative goods and services. This was fundamental to the dynamic mapping model, which focused on workforces defined by occupations that had a high number of creative skills utilised in them. We think this is a really fundamental distinction, and many of the debates about the CCI inclusions over the years would reflect a form of shadowboxing that have overlooked this key distinction. And by shadowboxing, we mean that they've been working with incommensurate concepts that don't really match up. Cultural or creative goods and services is just a very different kind of concept in economics to creative skills, and we're looking at human creative skills here. So Creative Trident Mark III, the model that Marion's just walked through with Australian data, shows how this latter approach, focusing on creative skills, is fundamental to seeing the coherence of the sector. So next slide, Marion, if you're doing slides. Our second point gets to the coding of relationships between fields of education and occupations. So you would have heard that we didn't go with a prevalence count model where we define creative fields of education in terms of their prevalence with an occupation. Rather, we developed a concordance table based on the descriptions of those fields of education and fields of work, of occupations. We note that fields of education, and many people have worked on this, not just ourselves in different jurisdictions, they're not structured like industry segments, with neatly corresponding occupational groups. And this is mainly because there's educational statistics of different sets of stakeholders, different interests within the education system. So this fuzzy relationship to occupations is the norm. And while we see this sort of distribution of creative skills across occupations within creative industries and beyond. But at the same time, we don't want to think that occupational codings are fixed. Creative occupations are of course historically dynamic, even if their revision is very slow moving. As Marion mentioned, we have a new framework for occupations coming into effect in Australia, the OSCAR. And this has 2 codes for social media content creators, one for cultural professionals, another for advertising. And this is a really important reminder that occupational classifications can have their origins in social uses of technology. So the occupations themselves change as creative skills come into the market. And next slide, thank you, Marion. And our final point to round this out is that We're obviously working with the dynamic mapping model of creative occupations, first developed by Bakshi, Freeman and Higgs in 2013. And we note that this has served CCI research really well. Was itself an important paradigm change, arguably within creative industries research. We'd note, though, that the rise of artificial intelligence, automated systems and machine learning, as well as the platform economy, now place significant pressure on this model. And a number of people in creative industries research are really looking into this at the moment. The 5-point criteria in creative skills to recall novel processes, resistance to mechanization, non-uniform functions, creative roles within the value chain, and the role of interpretation in the process. These require, we'd argue, review and revision in the current moment. And there's a whole range of questions here around skills augmentation and substitution, as well as we'd note of changing market and audience perceptions of human creative value, as well as the response of creative workforces to these developments. One of the virtues of the dynamic model, mapping model, was that it factored in the role of audiences and markets for creative products that led to particular kinds of creative skills being used by the sector. So how audiences and markets respond to the changes currently underway with the platformisation of cultural production and the role of machine learning and automated systems in that obviously have great import for how we define creative skills and the kinds of creative skills that we see in the sector. So that's the third and sort of final macro level consideration concerning defining creativity that we'd leave you with. And thank you all for listening.
Well, thanks very much, Stuart, Marion and Scott, for that terrific presentation. And for those of you that are keen to sort of delve into the figures more, just to say that an academic publication is very shortly forthcoming, and I think will be available within a couple of weeks. So you'll be able to delve into the details of those results in in your own time. So can I please just encourage people to post their questions in the Q&A function. I see that we've got some questions coming in. I'm just going to kick off the discussion and abuse my position as chair, if I may. One of your slides quoted the key result that in 2021, 6.5% of the Australian workforce held a creative qualification. So my question is, how do we assess whether that's too low, or indeed, if successive education ministers in the UK are to be believed, is too high? Have you considered looking at salaries data to estimate the value added contribution of different creative qualifications?
Haven't got there yet, but absolutely yes. I mean, we do find, and we've done a lot of work with on mean incomes and median incomes with the more traditional Trident, and we certainly find that the creative workforce earns higher incomes than the rest of the workforce, and their incomes grow at a faster rate as well. So we'd be expecting to, well, I would be expecting to see that. I'd be very surprised if I didn't with qualifications as well. We just haven't got there yet.
Thank you. So we've got a question in a function, which is, have you seen a difference between those creative qualifications that are more vocational in nature vis-a-vis those that are more academic?
We haven't.
I don't know who's best placed to answer.
We haven't categorized the qualifications that we're looking at like that. There is another classification scheme within the ASCED for levels of education, and again, that's a next step with this analysis. We haven't unpacked levels yet, and from there we can go from postgraduate qualifications all the way down to school leavers.
Thank you. And we've got a sort of related question from Valentina Montalto, which is there anything in your study which specifically helps you assess the effect of arts and cultural management studies on creative occupations? Obviously, it's a common concern that you hear in the creative industries is that there's too much focus on creative skills, and actually business skills and entrepreneurship skills are as important. Is that something that you've seen in the data?
Absolutely, yes. Absolutely. And look, it was one of the challenges with the prevalence method. We were seeing business graduates very, very high. They're constantly being caught by the threshold. And as much as we were more than happy to accept that skills such as business are really important in the creative industries, the creative and cultural industries, they weren't the qualifications we were trying to pinpoint here. So what we see is a real mix. We also see that we've got another statistical collection here called Work and Qualifications. It's a sample survey, and it makes available the 5 top qualifications that a person has, and also what they regard as their most relevant qualification to their job. So we looked at that survey and compared it with the census because we wanted to get a feel for whether the limitations of the census meant that we were going to be seeing something that didn't really resemble the full breadth of qualifications that people might have. And it was consistent across the census and across the Work and Qualifications survey that you see skills like, or qualifications like business, like accountancy, a whole lot of different skills that come through. And of course, we recognise them in the Trident, that support worker category or box is very important for ensuring that we always capture the occupations and the qualifications that feed into creative occupations or to creative industries, and that they're not excluded.
So it's worth mentioning that one of the slides showed that there was a very high, almost the same number of qualifications that are non-creative held by those in creative occupations as creative occupations. So that we haven't gone into the fine detail of that as the question asks, but it does underline the fact that there's a diversity of qualifications, remembering always that these qualifications are the highest qualification, not the most. Marion referred to the most relevant and the top 5 qualifications. That's from a survey, a different data set, but census only gives us the highest qualification. I might also just allude to the earlier question, if I may, Hassan, the question that asked about vocational versus more academic. One of the great things about linkage grants that I referred to briefly at the start was that you're working with industry, you're working with industry sectors. Now, in our case, we're talking about 4 government or municipal sectors. Industry is very broadly defined in Australia in the ARC, the Australian Research Council remit. So these government sectors, there's one that's particularly interested in a breakdown of their states, what are called vocational education, further education sector quals, as distinct from university qualifications, because you've got a situation where the states are particularly, they have particular remit for vocational rather than university quals. So we will be doing some work for them on breaking down their state's mix of vocational stroke further ed or vocational education and higher education, i.e. university. So yes, we have real interest in that area. If we've got the bandwidth to do all this, yes, but that's certainly one of the areas that we'd like to go towards.
Thank you, Stuart. I mean, I guess another way of cutting the cake is to focus on transferable or transversal skills on the one hand, and often creativity is seen as one of those skills, and then specialist and sort of technical skills on the other. Is that a distinction that you've been able to look at in your data set? Has there been a particular disproportionate growth in transversal that's become a more generic skill that's demanded in the workforce, or is it more of a specialized skill phenomenon that you've seen?
I think, Scott, you should have a go at this if you don't, because you've got some firm views about transferability and transferable skills.
Well, the short answer to your question, Hassan, is no, we haven't looked at the prevalence of creative fields of education in non-creative industries. So we haven't filled out that third model of the Trident yet to look at that. However,
sorry, Scott,
yeah.
I have.
Yeah, okay.
And it's a very similar pattern. But of course, you've got proportionally, it's a much smaller group of people as well, so it gets swamped out by all of the other qualifications that are there. But it is a very similar pattern.
Right.
Sorry, Scott.
Oh, that's okay. Look, I mean, I was just going to add that yes, the question of creativity and transferable skills is something that we're looking into. Something I've come across as an important distinction in the education studies literature around between transferable skills such as communication, creativity, innovation, and so on, and graduate capacities to transfer their skills across domains. So what they sometimes gloss as transferability skills. And that discussion in Australia from the mid-90s was happening at the same time as people talking quite a bit about creativity, and the discussion of graduate capacities to transfer their skills across tasks, occupations, craft roles for their skills sounded very much like creative skills. Some of Ruth Bridgestock's work on protean skills, creative workers as having protean skills, and several other discussions. So yeah, that's certainly something we're looking at going forward.
Thank you. So I guess one of them, I mean, you acknowledged, Stuart, I think in your comments, and Marion also, and I think Scott, you also picked this up, but one of the most contested definitional issues, of course, in the creative industry has been the inclusion of IT software and computer services in the UK terminology. Can you say a little more about what your research has to say about the logic of this? You pointed out that you've taken quite a restrictive approach to defining what are qualifications in this area, and as a result of that, partly as a result of that, you found that a low percentage of qualifications in that sector are creative. But can you sort of follow through what the logical implications of that? Does that mean that they're actually is this strengthening the evidence for excluding this sector from the creative workforce on the grounds that creative qualifications are less important? Just say a little more about that, please.
Do you want to talk to that, Stuart, or do you want me to start off?
No. We should talk about why we excluded. What led us to move from essentially from 9.5. There were three reasons, but the key reason, one of the key reasons of the three, was the decision to exclude the NEC and NFD categories in software. So you should speak to that. I think.
Well, one of the things we have observed with the ANSCO occupation classification system is that in the creative industries in particular, the NEC, the NFD, so these are categories or classification boxes that sit in each group that are used to classify occupations that don't neatly fit in any of the larger occupation groups. So not elsewhere classified and not further defined. Within the creative industries generally, and especially in the more high-tech end, if you like, these are some of the most rapidly growing occupations in Australia. One of them that is also growing incredibly fast is journalism, because anyone who's a social media presenter ends up being put in this not elsewhere classified box or not further defined because there's nowhere else to put them. So something very similar has happened with IT. These are boxes that have grown at extraordinary rates. When you do a traditional Trident analysis as well, these are also occupations where incomes are growing very, very rapidly as well too. So they struck us as complete and utter outliers. So when we started looking at the combinations of jobs that we were finding in those areas, I mean, one of these areas is sales and marketing. real estate agents were being classified in there. I mean, they just clearly don't belong. So having real estate agents growing in there, you have an exploding property market just like we do. So the numbers of people that are qualifying as real estate agents and earning high incomes has increased rapidly as well. So that was driving these higher proportions that BCAR was calculating, but also in IT as well. So we weren't able to differentiate, say, a software programmer with particular specialization, whose specialization was so uncommon that it couldn't be put into a bigger box, with people who were simple systems managers. So we made the decision that we just shouldn't be including them at all. And you might remember that bar chart. You can see people that are sitting in other occupations, with other qualifications in software and digital content is very, very large, but we can't unpack it with the ANSCO. Once we have the OSCAR in place, we'll be able to get a much better handle of what that big red box actually consists of. So another census down the track, hopefully we'll have a more precise estimate of what a creative occupation in software actually looks like, or how many of them they are, what they're earning, how much they're growing.
Hassan, it was a decision to be as conservative as possible, given the degree of concern that we've registered and that we're responding to about the coherence of the sector, where we couldn't be clear and rigorous enough about including or excluding, we excluded. And whereas the BCAR group, Bureau of Communications and Arts Research, were quite happy to allow those to come in. Now we included in the traditional arts, we included the NFD and NEC categories because we can be very confident that those categories, which are not growing nearly as fast, are not. We've got a very good sense of what they may be, whereas we don't with this very high growth
because
area
those narrow
of
fields
software.
are a mix. Yeah. And I want to reiterate as well, with software and digital content, the numbers of people that we can definitively say are working with creative qualifications is very, very similar to the numbers in the more traditional arts sectors. So the proportion might be lower, but the actual numbers of people is very, very similar.
Absolutely. That's very striking. Thank you. And there are a couple of questions Helen Wood and Chris asked. Do you have any sense of the socio-demographic breakdown of those taking up particular creative programs and their progression into creative occupations? You'll know, Stuart, Marion, Scott, that pointing out the inequities in the creative workforce has been a very dominant theme actually in PEC work in recent years. So I'd be very interested to hear your answer on this about whether you've looked at the data in Australia.
Yes, we have. We recently completed a consultancy for Creative Australia, who is about to release a report on equity in the creative industries. I think the report's called Towards Equity. The differences are quite striking across where people live, their cultural backgrounds, whether they have a disability or not. There's some very stark patterns in the kinds of jobs people work in and the incomes that they're able to earn.
Thank you. So Eleanor Bird, changing tack a bit, Eleanor Bird has raised the question about sort of alternative statistical standards. You'll be aware, of course, that UNESCO has been consulting on its new framework for cultural stats. Has that informed your methodology and or shaping your approach in any way? And more generally, I guess, we're a global community of research. To what extent have you been looking at emerging standards in other countries?
Not with this piece of work. With other work, yes. We haven't had the opportunity to consider that in the light of this particular project. But other work we're doing on cultural value, yes.
Thank you. Just skimming through the questions to see if there's anything on a related topic. lessons can be drawn? Yes, so maybe changing tack again. Creative industries and HE are valued differently in different countries. So what lessons can be drawn for countries which may not value these types of higher education programming or do not have the capacity to track trends in these areas? As I say, the audience for this seminar is very, very global. And so I think that would be a very pertinent question. You know, what are the lessons for other countries?
Yes, well, I suppose, Scott, you've done more work than either of us on this, but you've mostly done it in your international work has really been with UK researchers. Do you have any sense of what we might want to say of any that's of any value to those who don't have the kind of resource space that we've been able to draw on?
Well, I can't say much about resource space. Do you mean in terms of statistics and you know, government statistics on graduate outcomes, frameworks for measuring fields of education, these sorts of resources? Yeah, I will look in an international frame. A key word of caution around applying these frameworks and models is that they have to be locally applied. A number of years ago, I worked through with a team in the UK, including Roberta Communian, developing a concordance table via UNESCO's framework for cultural statistics from 2009, I think it was, for UK and Australian fields of education, occupations, and then working through some comparative data that way. We quickly realised just how different those frameworks were in both countries, and the education statistics were profoundly different. So local adaptation was you know, fundamentally important to that activity. Yeah, that's all I would add to that. Yeah, so you know, we've modelled Australian data here, but working through field of education at a very granular level where that's available. Looking at the descriptions of these fields of education, working through the occupation descriptions in a concordance table. There's sort of no way around it. There's no quick way to do this. Yeah.
It reminds me of the situation back, gosh, when was it, Stuart, when we collaborated on applying the Creative Trident in the UK for the first time, 2007, 2008. And of course, one of the challenges then in implementing what was developed in Australia and New Zealand was that the census data in the UK was not sufficiently granular to do a straightforward.
And of course that it was conducted on a 10-year basis, not a 5-year basis. And so your work, that work at Nesta and presumably ongoing, you know, has had to rely on quite other data sources than census.
Yeah. I mean, the other limitation, of course, in the UK census, that we don't have incomes data, so we were unable to use the census in quite the same way you've been able to in Australia. I mean, one other question, sort of, we're drawing to a close. I have to draw to a close shortly, but the sort of revisiting this question of IT. Simeon Ellerton has raised the question about whether the phenomenon of convergence of screen technologies is. Are you seeing anything in the data which the balance of occupations is changing, particularly on this nexus between ICT and cultural production? Is that something you're seeing in the data?
Look, there's a lot of change in that film, TV and radio area. You know, the way the ANSCO is set up, it had differentiated between television presenters and radio presenters, and of course we've now got this blurring between the two. And the Oscar has introduced a new, broader media presenter category, just as one example. And we're going to be losing some of the finer definitions in the roles and whether they are screen industry specific or stage specific or radio specific. You see the awkwardness or the inapplicability, the growing irrelevance of the ANSCO in these NEC and NFD categories. They are the fastest growing occupations. So it becomes almost meaningless to be looking at these occupations at the finest level of detail. You've got to be able to pull them together to see overall trends. If you start looking at the fine-grained occupations, there are occupations that are in decline just because the functions, the tasks that people are doing are different now, and they don't comfortably sit in that box.
Super interesting. Thank you for that. So we've just got a few minutes left, so I might give you just before I close, are there anything, Stuart, Marion, Scott, you'd like to say by way of final comment on the work? I mean, I mentioned that the research findings will be available in a bit more detail soon, if people want to sort of follow up but are there any other final comments before I close the session?
Well, I should say that folk who want to read the paper on which this is based, it'll be online with cultural trends in a short while. So in the next weeks, we've just finished the proofing and the acceptance of the revisions, and the editorial process has said that, as you know, if you're in academia these days, it might be a long process to get there, but once they accept it, it goes online quickly until it finds its way into a volume and number later on. So look in cultural trends over the next month for a copy of the published academic paper.
And
Thanks
it will
so
be
much,
open
Stuart.
access.
Terrific. So everyone will be able to sort of quote and sort of cite the work. That's fantastic. And so let me thank you, Stuart, Marion, Scott, for your terrific presentation. Apologies to those who's asked questions I didn't get around to sort of inviting the presenters to respond to. This study is clearly significant. I can sort of see it's going to have the same global echoes or similar global echoes to the work that QUT and colleagues in Australia have been doing for a number of years. So thank you so much for that. I just wanted to mention to everyone that the recording of this presentation and seminar will be available on our YouTube channel, the Creative PEC's YouTube channel, shortly. And as Stuart just mentioned there, the paper itself will be available through Cultural Trends very shortly online. In terms of our next Creative PEC research seminar, on Thursday, the 6th of November at 1500, 3 p.m. GMT, Greenwich Mean Time, we've got two more of our Creative PEC research fellows, Graham Evans and Patricia Kaczynska from University of Arts London, and they'll be presenting on the role of culture-led regeneration in place transformation. And this and details of other events you can sort of stay tuned to by subscribing to our newsletter at the Creative PEC website. So with no further ado, let me close the session and thanks everyone again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you,
Cheers,
Hassan,
everyone.
and all at PEC. Thank you.